Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Wednesday, Yom Revi'i. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Stephen in New Hampshire, Melissa in Great Neck, Bella in Florida, Shandor in the Bronx, Joe in the Inland Empire, Renee in Indiana, Guy in Ohio, Joseph in Sierra Nevada, Roger in Philly, Lorraine in Texas, Belle in Texas, Samira, Lechem Shalom, Chaim in Florida, and Aoife in Florida, and Bob. Bob, I'm not sure where you are. Welcome, everybody. Great to be with you. I was going to do a double doff, but so much is going on. Just didn't happen. Yeah, there may be some announcements imminent, some cool stuff. Nothing I can say right now. But we're working very hard, and just the hours got away from me this afternoon. But I'm ready to go, and it'll be a short class with God's help. So let's do it. We're near the bottom of page 37a, and our daf today is page 37 here in Tractate Avoda Zara, the 27th volume of the Talmud. Excuse me. Continuing our discussion of Mishna number 5 in chapter 2. The Gemara returns to the matter itself that we digressed from yesterday. Yosef ben Yoezer of Tzureda testified with regard to the ale kamtza that is kosher. Right, we had some decrees yesterday about some matters that the students of Shammai, in conjunction with the students of Hillel, or in the period of the Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, made some rulings that will not be rescinded. And yesterday we were talking a lot about laws against intermarriage and intermingling. Here, and that kind of came as a result of something else that we had started talking about, right? So it's this, the Yosef ben Yoezer Tzureda testified with regard to the ale kamtza, that it is kosher, and with regard to the liquids of the slaughterhouse in the holy temple, that they are ritually pure, and with regard to one who touches a corpse, that he is impure. Really? That needed to be declared by somebody? Doesn't the Torah say that specifically? We'll come back to that. First, let's talk about this ale kamtza. And as a result of these rulings, they called him Yosef the Permissive. Right? Yesterday we saw that a court, if it permits something that had been prohibited by an earlier court, First of all, that's very rare. It takes a court that is greater in wisdom and greater in number than the earlier court. And even then, maybe they could do it once or twice, 3 times, no. So what did Yosef the Permissive permit that earlier courts had prohibited? So the Gemara asks, what is the El Kamtza? So Rav Papa says it is a long-headed locust called Shoshiva, and Rav Chia Bar Ami says in the name of Ula, it is a locust called Suzbil. It's a very unusual matter within the world of kashrut, or kashrus, right? What is kosher for Jews to eat? Generally speaking, we don't eat insects, right? Insects are not kosher, definitely not permitted for Jews to eat. But there are certain locusts / grasshoppers that a Jew may eat, that the Torah has said they are kosher for eating. The problem is most of them are not. So it takes tremendous expertise, the expertise of a sage, to determine which of those particular kinds of grasshoppers actually are permitted for eating. So the Gemara explains that Rav Papa says it is a Shoshiva, and accordingly Yosef ben Yoezer and the other rabbis disagree with regard to a long-headed locust. Right? It's a particular species of the locust. So one sage, the rabbis, holds that a long-headed locust is prohibited, and the other sage, Yosef ben Yoezer, holds that the long-headed locust is permitted. Rav Chia Bar Ami says in the name of Ula that it is a Suzbil. And accordingly, with regard to a long-headed locust, everyone agrees that it is prohibited. And here, they disagree with regard to a locust whose wings barely cover most of its body. One sage, Yosef ben Yoezer, holds that we require only a minimal majority of the locust's body to be covered by its wings. And the other sage, the rabbis, hold that we require a noticeable majority of the body to be covered. Again, this is way beyond, the average person to figure this out. You need to be guided by a rabbi, a very knowledgeable rabbi, to know which of these insects are permitted for eating. So generally speaking, don't eat any insects. 37, just to be on the safe side, right? Now page 37b. And it was stated above that Yosef ben Yoezer testified with regard to the liquids of the slaughterhouse in the temple, right, in the holy temple when it was standing, that they are ritually pure, right? Tahor, not ritually impure. Again, this has nothing to do with germs, with sanitary matters, hygiene, illness. We're talking about ritual purity and impurity, substances that come into contact, for example, with a corpse, then can become tameh, render something else tameh. We know elsewhere that, for example, grain can definitely become tameh, can become ritually impure, but not until it comes into contact with liquids. One of the 7 liquids, it has to acquire some moisture before it can become tameh. Can the liquids become impure? That's a subject of dispute as well. Here, very interesting, we're talking about the liquids of the slaughterhouse. So basically blood, but maybe other liquids as well. Why? Because animals were brought to the holy temple and they were slaughtered there and offered as offerings upon the altar. So it seems like the blood of an animal, which can it become tameh, can it not become tameh, can be used to make some other substance moist, and therefore then it could contract tumah. Those are other questions, but it seems like we're making a distinction between blood found outside the temple and blood found on the slaughterhouse floor inside the temple. These animals, obviously, if they were brought into the temple to be offered as an offering on the altar, they had to be tahor. Or they would be disqualified from being brought there to be slaughtered and offered up on the altar. So that may be one reason why these particular, liquids of the slaughterhouse floor in the temple are tahor, pure, ritually pure, and not impure. So Rav says he meant that. The Gemara asks, what did Rabbi Yosef ben Yoezer mean when he said that these liquids are pure? What does that mean? It can mean different things. Rav says he meant that they are actually ritually pure, right? They have not become tameh, they are not tameh, or perhaps they're incapable of becoming tameh. And Shmuel says they are pure in the sense that they do not impart tuma. They do not impart ritual impurity to other substances, but they themselves can contract impurity. Now, the Gemara explains the reasons for these opinions. Rav says that these liquids are actually pure, as he maintains that the ritual impurity of liquids applies by rabbinic law, and when the sages decreed impurity upon liquids, they did so only with regard to ordinary liquids. But the sages did not issue their decree with regard to the liquids of the slaughterhouse in the temple. Now, another reason for that is when the sages issued rabbinic decrees to protect us from coming to violate written laws of the Torah, right, drawing that fence around the Torah, very often those decrees do not apply in the holy temple. That's a very holy place, and the holiness of that place is protected by the Kohanim, who have all kinds of special rules and instructions that apply only to them, in addition to the customs that the priests developed in the holy temple. And the sages didn't need to, impose additional decrees to preserve the Kohanim from coming to violate Torah laws or maintaining their purity. The Kohanim had that covered, right? So this very often decrees of the sages do not apply inside the holy temple because the holy temple has its own set of protections. And so that might be one reason why, here we're saying that, okay, liquids are only actually become tameh by rabbinic decree, not by written Torah law. And so since that's already a rabbinic decree for this protection, we wouldn't apply to liquids inside the holy temple. That's one possibility. And Shmuel says the liquids are ritually pure in the sense that they do not impart impurity to other substances, but they themselves can contract impurity, as Shmuel maintains that the tuma of liquids themselves is by Torah law, it's not just by rabbinic decree, whereas their capacity to impart tuma to other substances, that is by rabbinic law. And when the sages issued this decree, they did so only with regard to ordinary liquids, but they did not issue their decree with regard to the liquids of the slaughterhouse in the holy temple. It was stated, and Yosef ben Yoezer testified with regard to one who touches a corpse that he is impure. And as a result, they called him Yosef the Permissive. Didn't he just say something that would be a stringency, that somebody became impure because they came into contact with a corpse? Why would they call him for issuing that ruling, the permissive? What's going on? The Gemara questions this. Since he issued a stringent ruling, they should have called him Yosef the Prohibiting. And furthermore, this law is explicitly written in the Torah, as it is written, and whosoever in the open field touches one that is slain with a sword, or one that is dead, or a bone of a man, or a grave, shall be impure 7 days. That's the source of a mace tuma, right? The tuma that a human corpse imparts to a Jew. So the Gemara, that's Numbers 19:16. So why would he need to issue a ruling about that? The Torah has already decreed that that is so. So the Gemara explains, by Torah law, one who touches a corpse is tameh. But one who touches another person who has touched a corpse is tahor. He doesn't receive the impurity of the first person. And the sages came and decreed that even one who touches another who has touched a corpse is also tameh. And Yosef ben Yoezer came and established the law in accordance with the original, more lenient Torah law. If I touch a corpse, I become tameh with corpse tuma, right? That's the heaviest kind of tuma. Before I could enter the holy temple, I would have to be sprinkled with the waters of sprinkling that contain the ashes of the red heifer on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. And then I have to guard myself from coming into contact with that kind of impurity during those 7 days. Then I immerse in the mikvah. Then I await nightfall. And then I'm permitted to enter the holy temple. Yeah, that's if I come into contact with a corpse. So what the sages said is, but if I now touch somebody else, now he doesn't have the same level of tuma that I have when I touch the corpse. So his purification is going to be easier to accomplish, but he still is tameh because he touched me and I touched a corpse. Sounds like Yoezer ben Tzureda says, no, I get that corpse tuma, but if I touch this other living person, he doesn't become tameh. Now the Gemara raises difficulty. One who touches another who has touched a corpse is also rendered tameh, not by rabbinic decree, by Torah law. As it is written, and whatsoever the impure person touches shall be tameh. So the sages stated this difficulty before Rav in the name of Mar Zutra, the son of Rav Nachman, who said in response in the name of Rav Nachman, by Torah law, one who touches another, who touches a corpse, while the second individual is in concurrent contact with the corpse, is impure with 7-day impurity. If this occurs while the second individual is not in concurrent contact with the corpse, he contracts impurity only until the evening. And the sages came and decreed that even when there is no concurrent contact, one still contracts the full 7-day impurity when he touches someone who had touched a corpse. And subsequently, Yosef ben Yoezer came and established the law in accordance with the original Torah law, meaning that the telephonic tuma, right, the one who gets it from the one who has the corpse tuma, has a lower level of tuma. And so that seems like we now follow, or at least, Yosef ben Yoezer lowered the relative tuma of the second person, unless the second person touches the first person while the first person is touching the corpse, then it flows right through. But if the first person already touched the corpse and then he comes into contact with the second person doesn't have to go through the full 7-day purification. He just has to wait till leaving and immerse in a mikveh, etc. The Gemara asks, and let's see, where did the law end up? By Torah law, one who touches another who came into contact with a corpse is rendered impure until the evening, regardless of whether or not there was concurrent contact between the corpse and the two individuals. By rabbinic law, one who comes into contact with someone who is currently touching a corpse is rendered impure for 7 days. Tosafos contend that this impurity applies actually by Torah law. The Gemara asks, what is the source of this law prescribed by Torah law? As it is written, he that touches the dead, even any man's dead body, shall be impure 7 days, from Numbers 19:11. And it is written, and whatsoever the impure person touches shall be impure, in Numbers 19:22. So these two verses indicate that one contracts tuma for 7 days. And yet it is also written, and the soul that touches him shall be impure until evening. So how can these two texts be reconciled? So the Gemara answers here, in the first two verses, the Torah is discussing the concurrent contact. If I touch Joe while Joe is touching a corpse, then I get the same tuma that Joe has. But if I only touch Joe after Joe touched a corpse, I get that lesser degree. There in the last verse, it is discussing a case where there is no concurrent contact, and therefore the individual in question is impure only until the evening. Rav said to the sages who suggested that explanation, citing Rav Nachman, didn't I tell you not to hang empty pictures upon Rav Nachman, i.e. not to attribute incorrect statements to him? Rather, this is what Rav Nachman said. Yosef ben Yoezer permitted for them a case of uncertain tuma contracted in a public domain. In other words, Yosef ben Yoezer ruled leniently that one who was unsure whether or not he came in contact with a corpse in the public domain is tahor. He did not become tameh, right? Because there's already a double uncertainty here. It was in the public domain and it's uncertain. So the Gemara raises a difficulty. But didn't we learn this law from the case of a woman suspected by her husband of having been unfaithful, that she would be a sota? And just as a sota can be made to drink the bitter waters only when she is suspected of engaging in adultery in a private domain, so too, uncertain tuma is considered impure only when one suspects that he came into contact with it in a private domain. And this shows that even by Torah law, one who is unsure whether or not he touched a corpse in the public domain remains pure. Yosef ben Yoezer didn't need to make that ruling. Rabbi Yochanan said in explanation, this is the law, but a public ruling is not issued to that effect. Consequently, the masses treated this matter with stringency. And Yosef ben Yoezer came and instructed the masses to follow the original instruction of the Torah. Therefore, his ruling was, in fact, a leniency. The Gemara provides support for Rabbi Yochanan's explanation, and this is also taught in a baraisa. Rabbi Yehuda says that Yosef ben Yoezer drove stakes into the ground for the people and said, until here is the public domain, and until there is the private domain, so that they would know the law if they suspected that they had touched a corpse. And the Gemara relates that when people came before Rabbi Yana because they suspected that they might have come into contact with a source of impurity in the public domain, he said to them, "Why involve yourselves in matters of uncertainty? There is deep water in the river. Go immerse yourselves in it and resolve the problem in this manner. You don't need to be uncertain. You could just immerse in the mikvah." The Mishnah teaches, and boiled vegetables prepared. Now we're back to our Mishnah about substances that belong to idolaters, which are prohibited for consumption, but may be permitted for benefit. A Jew could buy and sell them even though he can't eat them. So the Mishnah teaches, and boiled vegetables prepared by idolaters are prohibited. The Gemara asks, from where is this matter derived? And Rabbi Chiya bar Abba says that Rabbi Yochanan says, the verse states that when Moses asked Sihon, the king of the Amorites, for passage through his land, and he said, "You shall sell me food for money that I may eat, and give me water for money that I may drink." So by juxtaposing food and water, the verse teaches that food is like water. Just as Moses wished to purchase water that was unchanged, so too he wished to purchase food that was unchanged, i.e. uncooked. Evidently, this is because foods that are cooked by idolaters are prohibited. You can purchase produce from the idolaters, but you can't purchase cooked food from the idolaters. The Gemara raises the difficulty of that is so then in a case where an idolater had wheat and he made it into roasted grains by roasting it in the oven, the wheat should also be prohibited as it was cooked. And if you would say, indeed that is so, well, but this cannot be the law, as isn't it taught in a Baraisa, if an idolater had wheat and he made it into roasted grains, it is permitted. So the Gemara suggests a different explanation. Rather, food is like water in the following manner. Just as Moses wished to purchase water that was not altered from its original state, so too he wished to purchase food that was not altered from its original state. Roasting wheat kernels does not alter their original state. They have been heated, but they're not, cooked with other ingredients and turned into something different. So the Gemara raises another difficulty. But if that is so, then if an idolater had wheat and he ground it into flour, the flour should also be prohibited, as the wheat has been altered from its original state, not mixed with other vegetables, but fundamentally altered, right? When wheat becomes flour, it's no longer recognizable as those wheat grains. And if you would say, indeed, that is so, this cannot be the case, as isn't it Tana Baraisa? If an idolater had wheat and he made it into roasted grains, it is permitted. And similarly, flours and fine flours belonging to idolaters are permitted. So rather, since it's not teaching that, what is it teaching? Food is like water in the following manner. Just as Moses wished to purchase water that was not altered from its original state by fire, so too he wished to purchase food that was not altered from its original state by fire. Although wheat ground into flour is altered from its original state, the change is not accomplished by means of fire. And the Gemara raises the difficulty, is fire written in the verse? There's no mention of fire in the verse at all. How can it be assumed that this is the similarity between water and food that Moses intended? Now we're on page 38a. So rather, the cooking of idolaters is prohibited by rabbinic law. And that verse is cited as mere support. It's not a proof. The Gemara discusses the particulars of the prohibition against eating the cooking of idolaters. Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak says that Rav says any item that is eaten as it is, i.e. raw, is not subject to the prohibition against eating the cooking of idolaters. And the Gemara remarks in the study hall in Surah, they taught it this way. In Pumbedisa, they taught it like this. Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak says that Rav says any item that is not eaten together with bread on the table of kings is not subject to the prohibition against eating the cooking of idolaters. In other words, foods that are not eaten by distinguished individuals are not subject to this prohibition. Sounds interesting distinction. So if it's like fancy cooked dishes made by idolaters, can't eat it. But if it's something so simple that peasants eat it but kings don't, maybe it is permitted. The Gemara asks, what is the practical difference between these two opinions? The practical difference between them is with regard to small fish, mushrooms, and porridge. These foods are not eaten raw, but they're not eaten by distinguished individuals. Consequently, these foods are prohibited according to the version taught in Surah, but permitted according to the version taught in Pumbedisa. Rav Asi says that Rav says small salted fish are not subject to the prohibition of the cooking of idolaters because they can be eaten raw. Rav Yosef says if an idolater roasted these fish, a Jew may rely upon them for use in the mitzvah, the commandment of joining of cooked foods, which must be prepared in order to permit cooking for Shabbos on a festival that occurs on a Friday. You can't cook on a festival food that you're going to plan to eat after the festival is over. You know, cooking is permitted on a festival. You can't cook for for the next day during the festival. You can only cook during a festival for the needs of that festival. But what if the festival falls on Friday, right? On Shabbos, you can't cook at all. So if you can't cook on Friday for Saturday, then it makes it difficult to eat on Saturday. So what are you going to do? You have to cook on Thursday. What if it's a 2-day hog, right? So if it's a 2-day festival, like outside of Israel, it's Thursday and Friday, and then comes Shabbos. Do you have to do all the cooking for Shabbos on Wednesday? But then the food for Shabbos won't be very good. So we have this Erev Tavshilin, which allows us to sort of join, it's a legal device to join Shabbos and the festival days as a kind of continuous thing. You can't cook on Shabbos, but you will be able to cook, an extra amount for the festival, and if it's still left over, you can eat it on Shabbos, and it's okay. And so apparently, when you do this, you just have to set aside a little bit of food for the purpose, even before you start on that Wednesday, for example. You need a little bit of cooked food that's going to, set aside even before you start to join all this together. And apparently you could use some food that you purchased from an idolater as long as it was very simple food, like this small cooked fish, right? Small salted fish. And if an idolater made them into a casa de harsena, which is a dish of fish fried in oil and flour, that's too complex. The dish is prohibited. In this case, since the flour had not been edible, it is considered the cooked food of an idolater and prohibited for Jews. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The Gemara asks, isn't that obvious? What reason would there be to think that casa de harsena prepared by an idolater would be permitted for the Jew? And they go, why do we need this ruling that it's prohibited? Isn't that obvious? So the Gemara answers, this is taught lest you say that the salted fish, which one is permitted to eat, even if cooked by idolaters, is the essential component. Therefore, Rav Yosef teaches us that the flour is the essential component, and the dish is therefore considered the cooked food of an idolater. Rav Baruna says that Rav says, in the case of an idolater who ignited a fire in the meadow, all the locusts that were burned in the meadow are prohibited because they were essentially cooked by the fire that the idolater started. And the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances of this case if we say that the reason they are prohibited is that one no longer knows which of these locusts are kosher and which are non-kosher as a result of their burning? Why does Rav Baruna specifically discuss a case involving an idolater? Even if a Jew burned the meadow, they would also be prohibited for the same reason. Rather, this is referring to a case where all the locusts were kosher, and the prohibition is due to the cooking of idolaters, as the locusts were effectively cooked by the idolater. But the Gemara objects. Does anyone actually prohibit the cooking of idolaters in a case like this? But doesn't Rav Hanan Bar Ami say that Rav Peda says, that Rabbi Yochanan says, with regard to this idolater who singed the head of an animal, it is permitted to eat part of it, even from the tip of the ear, which is fully cooked. And the Gemara remarks, evidently this is permitted because the idolater merely intends to remove the hair and not cook the ears. Here too, it ought to be permitted because he merely intends to clear the meadow, not to cook the locusts. He's not cooking locusts. Right? He's just starting one of these little brush fires to clear the meadow. I mean, like a controlled fire of a farmer. So the Gemara answers, actually, this is referring to a case where there is a mixture of different kinds of locusts, and they are prohibited because one does not know which are kosher and which are not kosher. And the reason that Rav Baruna specified that the case involved an idolater is because the incident occurred that way. It involved, because the incident that occurred happened to have occurred with the involvement of an idolater. We're not to learn rules about idolaters from it. It just happened to have involved an idolater. That's where we're going to stop, and I'll take some questions. Roger, so what exactly made a court greater than a previous one? So somehow, right, greater in wisdom and number. Number, okay, that's easy. So if you had, a court of 3 sages acting as a court, and they issued a ruling, and then later they could be overruled by a Sanhedrin, or even a minor Sanhedrin. Minor Sanhedrin is 23. The great Sanhedrin is 70 judges. So that's number. Wisdom, that's rough. But, if you're talking about it was like a regional court, and now it's the Sanhedrin that contains the great Gedolim, right, the greatest sages of that generation, then you could say that even though that other court came earlier, which generally we give precedence to, this later court was not only greater in number, but it was much more distinguished, right? In its generation, it was the greatest sages of the generation, and the earlier court that they're overruling wasn't necessarily the greatest judges, the greatest sages of that generation. So that might enable it to happen. Joseph, I've seen kosher grasshoppers sold from the land of Israel in an ad on Facebook. Right. And presumably, they got a ruling from an expert rabbi in these matters to make sure that it is a kosher grasshopper that is being sold. Sharon, if a non-Jew touches a corpse, he's not tameh, right? Because tuma only applies to Jews. Does a Jew who touches him also not become tameh? Ooh, great question. Right, so tuma only applies to Jews. This idea of becoming ritually impure in this way only applies to Jews. We are all assumed, by the way, to be tameh, because there's no one who's concerned that Jews don't become tameh, and therefore marking every grave. And so we don't, it's possible that we walked over a grave and didn't even know it. That's why we're all assumed to be tameh. But what is the law? And if a non-Jew touches a corpse, presumably he doesn't become tameh because he's not a Jew, and then you touch him. Now we've said that the sages decreed that all non-Jews are tameh, but sort of like just legally speaking, with the tuma of a nida for a woman, or a ziva for a man, like a man who had a seminal emission. But that's only by rabbinic decree, not by actual tuma, and that was just a decree meant as a policy to keep Jews from mingling with idolaters, because back then it was dangerous. They might murder the Jew. They're also steeped in idolatry and prohibited sexual practices, etc. But now you're asking a much more specific question. If they don't become tameh with corpse tuma, how could the Jew become tameh by touching them? I think the answer is they don't, right? They don't. Even though you touched a person that touched a corpse, since he's a non-Jew and didn't become tameh, my guess is the Jew does not become tameh. But that's just my guess. I could be wrong. That's for sure. Says Samir, even the one who touched the corpse can toivel anytime, but will remain tameh, impure until evening. A corpse can be a human or a sheretz or a rodent or other animal. Overshadowing is also an issue, and simply being around the corpse can impart tuma. Right, so you're talking about there's a few different things. There's touching a corpse, right? So that's for sure corpse tuma. And then you cannot become purified of that in modern times, because we don't have the ashes of a red heifer. And you can't become purified from that until you've been sprinkled by the water containing the ashes of the red heifer. That's for actual corpse tuma. Tumas oil, right? Like tuma being with a corpse under the tent, under a common roof. That's called, tuma of the tent. Does that create the 7-day tuma like direct contact does? I don't know. I can't remember. I should know, but I don't. But then you bring up the corpse of a sheretz. Now that definitely does not require the water of sprinkling, just immersion and waiting for nightfall. So that's why, even though we can never clear ourselves of corpse tuma from, well, it must be, right, that we can't clear ourselves of it. It doesn't mean we necessarily came into direct contact with it, but we walked over a grave. And tumas oil, I guess, has the same rules. But for a sheretz, we can purify ourselves, and it is a tradition, right, in certain groups, like Lubavitch, that they immerse in the mikveh every day, right? Now, they still can't toivel themselves out of corpse tuma because there's no ashes of the red heifer, but at least they can clear themselves of other kinds of tuma by immersing in the mikveh and waiting for nightfall. So there's just a mixture of issues that are in play here. But our understanding is that when Mashiach comes and the third temple is rebuilt, then there will also be a red heifer that can be slaughtered and burned and have ashes, and there'll be the waters of sprinkling again so that people can be purified before they enter the precincts of the Holy Temple. That's the tradition that I'm familiar with. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Thursday. Pretty sure I don't have a conflict. So yeah, tomorrow, Thursday, at the regular time, 6 p.m.